I still remember that night as if it happened yesterday. The wind was cold and sharp against my face, and the sky hung heavy with clouds that looked ready to burst. My husband, David, drove in silence, his hands tight around the steering wheel. We had just left our son's house after another painful argument, and the air inside the car felt heavy with words we could not take back. It had been months since we noticed something changing in him. Our sweet, gentle boy, Ethan, had grown distant, his laughter shorter, his eyes darker. He stopped visiting for dinners, stopped answering calls, and when he did come, he always looked tired and nervous. At first, we thought he was just stressed from work, but slowly the truth began to show through cracks we couldn't ignore. One afternoon, a man came to our door asking about Ethan. He spoke fast, his tone sharp and impatient. He said he was a business partner and that Ethan owed him money. I told him there must be a mistake because my son would never borrow money from Strand. First, the man laughed in a way that made my stomach twist and said, "You better ask your son what kind of business he's really in." Then he left, leaving me standing at the doorway trembling. When David came home, I told him everything. He listened quietly, then put his arm around me and said, "We'll talk to him tonight. We just need to stay calm and help him get out of whatever mess this is." That was my husband, always calm, always steady, even when my heart wanted to break. That evening we drove to Ethan's house. It was late, but his car was in the driveway and the light was still on inside when he opened the door. His face looked shocked to see us. He said, "Mom, Dad, what are you doing here?" We walked in and I could feel his tension filling the room. I said, "Ethan, someone came to the house today, said you owed him money. Is that true?" He sighed and rubbed his face like he was trying to erase the question. "I'm handling it." He said, "You don't need to worry," but I couldn't stop my tears. I said, "Ethan, we're your parents. If something is wrong, we can fix it together." He looked away and whispered, "You wouldn't understand." David spoke, then his voice firm but gentle. "Son, we raised you to be honest. You need to tell us what's going on. Who are these people?" Ethan's eyes flickered with something between fear and anger. He said, "Dad, please just leave it alone. It's better that way." Then he turned away as if to hide his own shame. We left the house that night in silence. I wanted to reach for him one more time, but David shook his head softly. "Not now," he whispered. "We'll come back tomorrow when he's calm." But tomorrow never came the way we planned. The next morning we received a call from the police. They said Ethan's name had come up in an investigation related to stolen goods and that he might be in trouble. I felt the ground disappear under me. I couldn't breathe. My own son. How could this be true? David sat me down and said, "We'll go talk to him before things get worse." That's how we found ourselves, driving that cold, windy knee teeth through the hills on the old mountain road where Ethan liked to clear his head, we had called him earlier, and he agreed to meet us there, said he wanted to explain everything. I tried to believe him, tried to hold on to hope that maybe this was all a misunderstanding. When we reached the spot near the overlook, his car was already parked there. He stood by the edge, his jacket fluttering in the wind. He didn't look like my boy anymore. His eyes were hollow, his face pale. I stepped toward him and said, "Ethan, please talk to us. Just tell the truth. We can still help you." He shook his head and whispered, "You should have stayed home, Mom. You shouldn't have come." Before I could understand what he meant, David took my hand and whispered, "Stay behind me." The air felt heavy with something I couldn't name. Ethan's voice broke. Then he said, "I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you to see what I've done." David said, "Son, whatever it is, we can face it together. We're family." Ethan looked down, then back at us with tears in his eyes. He said, "I never meant for it to go this far, but they're watching me. They know about you both. You have to disappear for a while. Pretend you're gone until I fix this." For a moment, everything went silent except for the wind. My husband looked at me, then back at Ethan, and whispered quietly, "Trust me, we have to do what he says." I didn't understand why until much later, but in that moment, I saw something in my son's eyes that told me this was not betrayal. It was a desperate act of protection, and right there on that lonely mountain road, our lives changed forever. The wind howled around us, and I could hardly see through the mist that covered the mountain road. David held my hand tightly and whispered again, Trust him, Mary. Just trust him. We stepped back toward the car, our hearts beating fast, and I could feel Ethan's eyes on us. He looked broken. Torn between fear and love, I wanted to run to him, hold him, tell him everything would be fine, but something deep inside me said that tonight, whoa, RDs were not enough. David started the engine and we drove slowly down the slope. The road curved sharply and the world outside was swallowed by darkness. I glanced back once more, but Ethan's figure was already fading behind the fog. My chest ached with the weight of 1,000 unspoken prayers. When we reached the small motel at the edge of town, David parked behind the building, away from the lights. He said softly, "We'll stay here for the night, then head somewhere safe tomorrow." He was trying to sound calm, but I could see the worry in his eyes. I nodded and tried to breathe slowly, but sleep never came to either of us. The next morning, the news on the motel television made my heart freeze. They were talking about a warehouse fire, downtown suspected criminal activity, a list of names under investigation, and Ethan's was one of them. The reporter said 2 people connected to the case were believed to have gone missing. David turned off the TV and said quietly, "They think that's us." He looked at me and Dee added, "That's what he meant, Mary. He needed us to disappear so the people chasing him would think we were gone for good." I sat there staring at the floor for a long time. My own son had dragged us into something we couldn't even understand yet, and still my heart refused to turn against him. David said, "We need to stay hidden until we know who is behind this. We'll contact the sheriff once we figure out who to trust." We packed a few things from the car and drove west toward the countryside. The landscape slowly changed from mountains to rolling fields. We stopped at a small town where nobody knew us. David rented a cabin from an old farmer who didn't ask questions. He paid cash and said we were visiting family for a few weeks. The man smiled kindly and handed us the key. That cabin became our shelter. It was small and quiet, with wooden walls that creaked at night and a fireplace that smelled of pine. We lived simply, cooked our meals on a small stove, and spent evenings listening to the wind through the trees. Sometimes I would stand outside at dusk and whisper into the air, "Ethan, wherever you are, please be safe." Days turned into weeks. Each morning, David went into town for supplies and news. He learned that the men who had been threatening Ethan were part of a stolen goods network. They were dangerous and unpredictable. One of them had been arrested, but others were still at large. I began to realize that Ethan hadn't been running from justice. He had been running from them. One afternoon, as I was hanging laundry behind the cabin, a shadow moved near the trees. I froze, thinking it might be one of those men. But when the figure stepped into the light, it was Ethan. He looked thinner, older, his clothes dirty, his face pale, but his eyes still had that spark of kindness. He whispered, "Mom, Dad, I found you." I couldn't believe it was him. I ran forward and held him so tight I thought my heart would burst. David stepped out from the cabin, and for a long moment, the 3 of us just stood there in silence. And finally said, "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I tried to protect you, but things got worse after you left. They think you're dead, and that gave me time to gather proof. I can expose them now, but I need your help." David looked at him quietly, then said, "What do you need us to do?" Ethan took a deep breath and said, "There's a man in town who knows everything, but he's scared to talk. He'll trust you. If you say you're family of mine, you just have to tell him I kept my promise, that's all." I wanted to say no, to tell him we had done enough running, but something in his voice made me believe he was finally doing the right thing. David put his arm around me and said, "We'll help, but you have to promise no more secrets." Ethan nodded and whispered, "I promise." That night, as we sat around the small fire, Ethan told us everything. He had taken a job at a shipping company that turned out to be a front for stolen imports when he tried to quit. They threatened him when they found out he had told the police. I came after him and anyone he cared about. He said, "I thought if they believed you were gone, they'd stop looking for you. That's why I begged you to disappear." I sat there in silence, listening to my son's voice crack with guilt. I reached for his hand and said, "You did what you thought was right, Ethan. You saved us." David looked into the flames and said, "Now it's time we save you." The next morning we packed again, this time not to run, but to stand with him. The fear was still there, but so was something stronger, a quiet faith that maybe together we could make things right. As we drove toward the small town, I looked out at the sunrise, spreading gold across the sky, and whispered to myself, maybe this is what courage really looks like. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep going anyway. The road was long and quiet that morning, the air heavy with the kind of silence that feels like it is waiting for something. David drove with both hands gripping the wheel, while Ethan sat in the back seat staring out the window. I could see his reflection in the glass. His eyes distant and tired. I wanted to reach back and touch his shoulder, but something held me still. After a few hours, we reached the small town Ethan had talked about. It was a simple place with old brick buildings and a gas station that looked like it had been there forever. Ethan asked David to stop near a diner on the edge of town. The smell of coffee and fried bacon drifted through the air, and for a brief second it almost felt normal, like we were just an ordinary family on a road trip. Ethan pointed to a man sitting alone at a corner table inside the diner. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with a gray beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Ethan whispered, "That's Hank. He used to work at the shipping yard with me. He knows everything, but he's scared they hurt his brother when he tried to talk to the police." David nodded slowly and said, "Stay here with your mother. I'll go talk to him." But Ethan shook his head. "No, Dad. He has to see Mom. He trusts her. He said once that my mom reminded him of his wife who passed away. That's why he listened." My heart started to race. I didn't want to go inside. I didn't want to play any part in this world of danger and lies. But when I looked at my son's eyes full of pleading and hope, I found myself saying softly, "All right, I'll go." Inside the diner, everything smelled of coffee and dust. I walked over to Hank's table and said quietly, "Hank, my name is Mary. I'm Ethan's mother." He looked up slowly, and I saw surprise flicker in his tired eyes. He whispered, "They said you were gone." I sat down and said, "Ethan kept his promise. He said you'd know what that means." Hank looked around nervously and lowered his voice. He said, "If he kept his promise, that means he still has the files. They've been looking for that proof for months. It's enough to send every one of those men to prison." I felt my stomach twist. I asked him what kind of proof it was. He said it was records, shipment logs, and payments. It showed who was behind everything, even people in positions of power. He said Ethan was brave, but he didn't realize how deep it went. Before I could say another word, Hank slipped a folded piece of paper across the table. He said, "Tell your son to meet me behind the old train depot at dusk. That's where we'll talk and no one will see us." Then he stood up, paid his bill, and walked out without another word. When I got back to the car, David looked at me anxiously. I handed him the paper and told him what Hank said. Ethan took it with shaking hands and whispered, "We can end this tonight." We spent the rest of the day waiting at a motel nearby. The hours crawled by. Slowly, each sound outside made me jump. My mind kept drifting back to when Ethan was a little boy chasing fireflies in our backyard, or asking me to read one more bedtime story. How had we gone from that sweet child to hiding from dangerous men and secret fires? At dusk, we drove to the old depot. The building stood silent and empty, surrounded by tall weeds and rusted tracks. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Ethan got out first, then David followed. I stayed in the car watching them walk toward the back of the building. Minutes passed, and my heart beat so loud it felt like thunder in my chest. Then suddenly I saw movement. A dark van pulled up near the far end of the lot. 3 men stepped out. Their faces were shadowed, but their posture told me everything. They were not here to talk. Without thinking, I opened the car door and shouted, "David, Ethan, run!" But before the words could leave my mouth, one of the men grabbed Ethan. David rushed forward, swinging his arm and shouting, "Leave him alone!" The sound of struggle echoed through the empty lot. I ran forward, screaming their names. My hands were trembling, my knees weak, but all I could think was I had to reach them before I could get too close. Hank appeared from behind a stack of crates, holding something in his hand. It was a flare he lit, and threw it onto the ground. The sudden burst of light startled the men. They turned and ran toward the van, speeding off into the night. When the dust settled, Ethan was on the ground, gasping for breath, but alive. David helped him up while Hank looked at us and said, "I knew they'd come. That's why I brought the flare." He turned to Ethan and said, "You can't stay here. They'll keep looking for you, but I have a friend at the FBI. He'll listen to me if I show him the files." Ethan nodded, still catching his breath. Hank gave us an address and said, "Go there tonight. Tell him Hank sent you." Then he walked away, disappearing into the shadows like a ghost. We got back into the car, shaken and silent. Ethan whispered, "I almost lost everything tonight, Mom, Dad. I'm sorry." David reached over and put a hand on his shoulder. "You're still here, son. That's what matters. We'll finish this together." As we drove away, the first stars appeared above the dark sky, and for the first time in weeks I felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe this nightmare was finally turning toward the light. Maybe the truth was strong enough to save us all. The drive to the address Hank had given us felt endless. The road stretched through dark forests and quiet towns where every light in a window made me wonder what it felt like to live without fear again. Ethan sat between us, staring out into the night, his hand resting on mine like a child who was afraid to let go. David drove in silence, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, and I could see the strain on his face, the lines of worry that had grown deeper over the last few weeks. When we finally reached a small brick house on the outskirts of the city, it was past midnight. A single porch light glowed above the door, casting long shadows on the driveway. Ethan stepped out first, looking around carefully before knocking twice. Then once more slowly. The door opened and a tall man in his 50s appeared. His hair was silver, his eyes sharp but kind. He looked at us for a long moment before saying soft, "You must be Hank's people. Come in quick before someone sees you." Inside the house, everything smelled of coffee and paper. The man introduced himself as Agent Walker, retired from the bureau, but still connected enough to know who to trust. He poured us coffee and listened as Ethan told the whole story from the beginning, the stolen shipments, the threats, the warehouse fire, and finally the files. Walker nodded slowly when Ethan handed him a small flash drive. He said quietly, "I've been following this case for months, but never had enough to make it stick. If this is what I think it is, then you just brought down some very powerful men." He looked at Ethan and added, "You did the right thing, son, but you've made enemies who won't stop easily." He promised to contact one of his old partners at dawn to start the process of bringing the case forward. He said, "Until then, we should rest, but not turn on any outside lights." He gave us blankets and led us to a small guest room in the back of the house. That night, as I lay beside David, I could hear the faint ticking of the clock in the next room and the whisper of the wind against the glass. I turned toward him and whispered, "Do you think we'll ever have our life back?" He reached for my hand and said, "I don't know, Mary, but at least now we're not running away. We're standing up for what's right." I closed my eyes and let the warmth of his hand remind me that we were still together, still breathing, still alive. Before sunrise, Walker woke us and said, "It's time, we have to go now." He had made contact with his friend Agent Miller, who was waiting at the safe location near the city courthouse. He said Miller would take the files directly to the federal office and make sure Ethan's name was cleared. We packed quickly and drove through quiet streets that glimmered faintly under the early light. The air smelled of rain and distant sea salt from the nearby bay. Ethan sat forward, watching every car that passed, as though expecting danger to appear at any moment. When we reached the courthouse parking lot, Walker parked behind the delivery truck and said, "Wait here, I'll go find Miller." He stepped out and walked toward the entrance, leaving us in the car. The air felt heavy. I could almost hear the rhythm of my own heartbeat. A few minutes later, Ethan turned to me and said softly, "Mom, thank you for believing in me even after everything." I looked at him and said, "That's what mothers do, Ethan. We believe even when the world doesn't." Just then, Walker came running back, his voice tense. "They're here, go now." He jumped into the passenger seat and David started the car without a word. Through the side mirror, I saw two black vehicles turning into the street headlights, glaring like eyes in the dark. Walker shouted, "Take the back route toward the marina. They won't risk a scene there." David swerved into an alleyway, tires skidding on wet pavement. My hands gripped the seat so tightly my knuckles turned white. Ethan reached for the flash drive in his pocket and whispered, "We can't let Em get this, no matter what." We raced through narrow lanes past empty warehouses and loading docks until the water came into view. The marina stretched ahead quiet. Except for the sound of waves hitting the wooden posts, Walker pointed to a small boat tied near the end of the dock. He said, "Get in. That'll take you across the bay. My friend will meet you there. I'll stay and delay them." Ethan grabbed his arm. "No, you can't," he said firmly. "I'm not leaving you here." Walker smiled faintly. "Son, I've been doing this longer than you've been alive. I can handle a few thugs now. Go." David didn't hesitate. He pulled me toward the dock, and we climbed into the small boat. Ethan followed. But before stepping in, he turned and looked back. Walker gave him a quick salute, then disappeared behind the crates. Moments later, we heard shouting and footsteps, but the wind drowned out the rest. David started the engine, and the boat began to move through the dark water. The city lights faded behind us, replaced by the soft glow of dawn over the horizon. I wrapped my arms around Ethan and whispered, "You're safe now, son." He nodded, but I could feel his shoulders trembling. He wasn't crying, but there was something heavy in his silence. When we reached the other side of the bay, a man in a black coat was waiting by the dock. He said, "I'm Agent Miller. Walker sent me. You did well. Now it's my turn to take it from here." Ethan handed him the flash drive. Miller looked at us and said, "We'll protect you until this is over. You have my word." He led us to a safe house nearby, a quiet cottage surrounded by tall trees. It wasn't much, but it felt safe for the first time in a long while. I saw Ethan's eyes soften. He said, "Maybe when this ends I can start over, Mom. Maybe I can live honestly again." I smiled and said, "You already started, Ethan. The moment you chose the truth, you started over." That night we sat together by the fireplace. The flames flickered, gently lighting our tired faces. David played with the cracked old radio until it hummed softly with static. Then faintly we heard music, an old tune from years ago, the one that used to play when Ethan was a boy and danced around the kitchen. I looked at my husband and my son, and I thought about everything we had lost and everything we still had. I whispered, The next morning, quiet, the sun rose "Thank you to the slowly stars through the outside trees, that even and in the for the darkest first time in moments, weeks, somehow I felt the love light had kept touched us my alive." face without fear. The birds were singing faintly, and the air smelled of pine and wet grass. David was making coffee on the small stove while Ethan stood by the window watching the road. His shoulders looked tense, even though his eyes seemed calmer. I walked over and touched his arm. He smiled faintly and said, "I forgot what mornings used to feel like." Agent Miller arrived just after breakfast with a small black case in his hand. He sat with us at the kitchen table and said, "The files are verified, and the Bureau has already started moving in on the people responsible. You did something brave, son." He looked at Ethan with quiet respect, but then his voice turned serious. "They will fight back, though we'll need to keep you here a while until things calm down." Ethan nodded silently. He seemed relieved, but also restless, like a man who finally saw light after living too long in darkness. Miller assured us that witnesses were being protected and arrests had already begun. David exhaled deeply, his shoulders finally relaxing for the first time in months. He looked at me and said, "Maybe we can finally go home, Mary," but I wasn't sure what home even meant anymore. That afternoon, while David helped Miller with some papers, I sat outside on the porch with Ethan. We watched the trees sway gently, and I said, "You know, when you were little, you used to say you'd build a treehouse up there one day and live in it forever." He laughed quietly and said, "Maybe I should have. I might have stayed out of trouble." Then I shook my head. "No, Ethan, you had to go through this to find your way back. Sometimes courage looks like survival, not perfection." For a while we sat in silence, just listening to the wind. Then Ethan turned serious again. "Mom, what if people never forgive me? What if all they see is the mistakes I made?" I took his hand and said, "If you live your life with honesty and kindness, the right people will see oh, you are not who you were. Forgiveness comes when you start forgiving yourself first." Evening came quietly. Miller left to make a call, and David went to gather some firewood. I stayed inside tidying the small kitchen. Then I noticed something strange through the window. 2 cars had stopped down the road. Their engines idled, but no one stepped out. My stomach tightened. I called for David. He came quickly, his eyes following my gaze. A moment later, Miller ran back inside, his face pale. He said, "They found you. We need to move now." He grabbed a bag from the table and motioned for us to follow. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. We followed him through the back door into the woods behind the cottage. The ground was soft with leaves, our footsteps barely making a sound. After a few minutes of walking, Miller led us to an old shed half hidden under vines. He opened the door and motioned us inside. "Stay quiet," he whispered. Then he crouched near the small window, watching the road from the distance. "I hear R&D car doors slam and voices calling out. They were searching, but not yet close enough. The minutes felt like hours. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. Ethan stood beside me, his hand gripping mine. I could feel his pulse racing. David whispered, "We've been through worse. We'll get through this too." And for some reason, I believed him. Finally, the sound of the engines faded away. Miller exhaled slowly and said, "They're gone for now, but we can't stay here longer." He looked at Ethan and said, "You're the key to this case. If anything happens to you, all the work we've done will mean nothing. We'll move you somewhere safer tonight." We left the shed and started toward a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting silver lines on the ground. The air was cold, but the fear in my chest burned hot. David kept close behind me while Ethan and Miller led the way. After nearly an hour of walking, we reached a small wooden bridge over a creek. The water beneath shimmered faintly under the moon. When we crossed, Miller stopped and said quietly, "There's an old ranger station about a mile ahead. We'll rest there before dawn." As we walked, I found myself thinking about how far we'd come from that first night of confusion and fear. I thought about how life can break us in ways we never imagined, but also teach us what strength really means. I whispered a small prayer under my breath, asking for one more sunrise, one more chance to see my family safe. When we finally reached the ranger station, it was quiet and empty, dust covering every surface. Miller checked the doors, then said, "It'll do for tonight. We'll leave at first light." David made a small fire in the old stone hearth, and soon the room filled with warmth. Ethan leaned back against the wall, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. I sat beside him and said, "You're safe for now." He nodded slowly and whispered, "I don't know how to thank you, Mom." I smiled softly and said, "Just live well. That's all the thanks I need." He closed his eye, and for the first time in months, he looked peaceful. I watched the flames flicker and dance, and I realized something beautiful. In that quiet moment, we had spent so long running from darkness that we had forgotten how it felt to rest in the light. Outside, the night was still and endless, but inside that small forgotten cabin, love had built a shelter, stronger than fear. Morning came quietly through the cracks in the old wooden walls. A pale light touched Ethan's face, and for a moment he looked like the little boy who used to wake up early on weekends asking for pancakes. David was still asleep beside the cold fire, his arm draped over a folded blanket. I sat near the window watching the forest come alive with sound birds calling, wind brushing through the tall trees, and water running softly in the creek below. Agent Miller was already awake, studying a map spread across the table. He said in a low voice, "We'll head north by noon. There's a contact waiting with a secure car once you're with him." "No one can reach you. The operation is in full motion. Now they're arresting people across 3 states. Ethan stirred and sat up, rubbing his eyes. He looked tired but calmer than before. He said, "Is it really ending?" Miller nodded slowly but added, "Not yet completely. There's still someone high up feeding information to the criminals. That's how they keep finding us." I felt a chill run down my spine and asked, "Do you know who it is?" Miller hesitated, then said softly, "Not yet, but I will soon. I just need to get you safe first." David woke and stretched, quietly listening as Miller gave directions. He said we'd have to move through the woods again to stay off the main roads. Ethan helped gather what little we had left, and by the time the sun climbed higher, we were ready to leave. The path was rough branches scratching at our clothes and damp leaves clinging to our shoes, but there was something peaceful about it too. Maybe because for the first time we weren't running blindly, we were walking toward something. The air smelled clean and alive, and every now and then I would catch Ethan glancing back at us, making sure we were close. His protective instinct had returned, and that small thing filled my heart with pride. After an hour of walking, Miller stopped suddenly. He raised his hand and whispered, "Someone's ahead." We froze listening, and then we heard it. Voices low and steady coming from the other side of the hill. David motioned for me to stay behind a tree while he and Miller moved closer. I could see them crouching near the ridge. Ethan stood beside me, tense and ready. The moment stretched painfully long until Miller returned, his face unreadable. He said, "It's clear, false alarm, just hikers." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. We continued until the trees thinned and a dirt road appeared. Winding through the valley below us stood an old barn with a faded red roof. Miller pointed toward it. "That's the meeting point," he said quietly when we reached it. A man in a leather jacket stepped out from the shadows. He looked cautious but friendly, and after a quick word with Miller, he motioned us toward a black SUV parked nearby. He said, "I'm Luke. I'll take you to the safe facility about 50 miles north. It's secure and only a handful of people know it exists." Ethan shook his hand and said, "Thank you, sir." Luke smiled faintly, "Just doing my part, son. The world still needs brave people like you." We climbed into the car and the ride began through long, winding country roads. The sun was warm on the horizon and the silence between us felt peaceful for once. Miller spoke softly from the front seat, saying, "The files are now in federal custody. The people who hurt you will face justice." Ethan stared out the window, his eyes glistening, and said, "I never thought I'd live to see this day." Halfway through the drive, Luke's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. Miller asked, "What is it?" Luke looked uneasy and said, "There's been another leak. Someone tipped them off. They know you're alive, Ethan." Anne stiffened. I felt my stomach drop. Miller swore under his breath and said, "Change of route, go west through the back roads." Luke nodded and turned sharply down a narrow gravel path. The car jolted hard over rocks and tree roots. The forest thickened around us, branches brushing against the windows. I could see dust swirling behind us like smoke. Then from the distance came the faint sound of another engine. David whispered, "They're following us." Miller turned and said, "Look faster." The SUV roared forward, the tires kicking up stones. Ethan gripped the seat and said, "Mom, hold on." The chase was quiet, but tense. I could see the other vehicle gaining through the trees. Then suddenly the road split left toward the river, right toward a rocky incline. Luke chose right. The car bounced violently, and for a moment I thought we would tip over. But Luke steadied it. Miller looked back and said, "They're still coming." Ethan shouted, "Give me the wheel, I can drive through the rocks better." Luke hesitated, then nodded. Ethan too, control his face, determined, his hands firm. He drove through the rough path like he had done it all his life. The pursuing car tried to follow, but lost traction, spinning in the dirt. The sound of their tires fading gave me the first breath of relief I had felt all morning. We kept driving until we reached a clearing overlooking a wide river. Miller said, "Stop here. We'll take the bridge ahead and switch cars on the other side." Luke radioed someone, then smiled faintly when a voice answered, "Copy that, they're ready for you." When we reached the bridge, I looked out at the water shimmering below the sky, bright with sunlight. Ethan slowed the car and said softly, "We made it, didn't we?" Miller turned and said, "Not yet, but almost." As the new team arrived and we were transferred to another vehicle, I stood there for a moment, feeling the wind on my face. David came beside me and said, "You were strong through all of this, Mary." I shook my head. "No, we were strong together." Ethan smiled, watching us. I saw in his eye a quiet peace I hadn't seen in years. He said, "I want to make things right for everyone I hurt. I want to work for something good from now on." Miller put a hand on his shoulder and said, "That's the best start anyone can make, son." As we drove away across the bridge, I looked at the river flowing steady and endless, and I thought maybe that was what healing really looked like. Not sudden, not perfect, just steady and moving forward, no matter how rough the path behind had been. The new car was quiet inside. The hum of the tires on the road sounded like a heartbeat, steady and soft. The landscape around us began to change. Fields gave way to open land where tall grass swayed gently under the morning sun. Luke drove, while Miller spoke on a small radio, confirming that we were clear. I sat in the back with Ethan and David watching the world pass by. It felt strange to see beauty again after so much fear. After a few hours, we reached the secure facility. It looked nothing like I imagined. It wasn't a big government building or a fortress. It was a quiet ranch surrounded by trees with a few cabins and a small guard post near the entrance. Luke said softly, "You will be safe here. No one knows about this place, except those who need to." He gave Ethan a reassuring nod before stepping out to talk with the guards. Miller stayed with us. He said the operation has moved forward faster than we hoped. Most of the men behind the crimes are now under arrest, but there's still one person on the inside who helped them stay ahead of us. Someone from law enforcement. Ethan looked worried and asked, "Do you think it's someone from the bureau?" Miller's face tightened slightly, and he said, "It might be. I just don't know who yet. That's why you need to stay here until it's over." We followed him into one of the cabins. The inside was small but cozy, a few wooden chairs, a bed, a kitchen corner, and a big window looking out over a field of golden grass. David smiled faintly and said, "It's not much, but it feels like peace." Ethan nodded and said, "It's more than we've had in a long time." Days passed slowly there. The air was clean and quiet. We cooked simple meals and sometimes sat outside watching the sunset fade into the trees in those moments. It almost felt like nothing bad had ever happened. Ethan started helping the staff at the facility, fixing fences, repairing tools, anything to keep his hands busy. I could see the light slowly returning to his eyes one day at a time. One evening Miller arrived again. He looked tired but hopeful. He said, "Good news, the ringleaders have confessed and the files have been fully verified. It's almost over." Ethan smiled weakly but then asked, "And the insider, did you find him?" Miller hesitated. "I'm close. There's someone high up feeding information to the criminals through coded messages. We've traced some of it, but I need to confirm one last lead." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing Miller's words echoing in my mind. The idea that someone inside the bureau could betray innocent lives was heavy. It made me think about trust, how fragile it can be and how easily it breaks. But even in that worry, I felt something else growing inside me, strength, maybe faith that somehow good would still win. The next afternoon, a storm rolled over the valley. Thunder echoed and rain hit the roof in steady waves. David and I were sitting near the window when Ethan came running in holding a letter in his hand. He said, "Mom, Dad, this was left outside near the porch, wrapped in plastic." I took it from him and saw no name on it, just a single line written across the front, "For the one who still believes." Inside was a small note written in neat handwriting. It said, "I was one of them. I helped hide the truth for years because they threatened my family. I am sorry. I will turn myself in by morning. I have left all my evidence with the man who saved your lives." It was signed with one letter, just a W. Ethan looked at me confused. "Miller, maybe," he said quietly. I shook my head, not sure. But something about that note felt sincerely. A confession of a man who had finally decided to do what was right. David said, "Keep it safe. We'll show Miller when he returns." That night the power flickered, the storm grew louder, and shadows danced across the walls. I sat near the fire, trying to read, but my thoughts kept drifting to the man behind the letter. Whoever he was, he had carried guilt heavy enough to crush a soul, and now he was trying to set it right. Near midnight we heard a knock on the door. David got up cautiously and opened it. Miller stood there, soaked from the rain, his coat dripping. He looked at us and said quietly, "It's done. They caught the last of them. The insider came in himself early this morning and confessed everything is over now." Ethan's face softened with relief. He said, "So it was true. He really turned himself in." Miller nodded yes, "And the evidence he brought will protect every witness connected to this case. You're all free to go wherever you want. Now you don't have to hide anymore." I didn't realize tears were foul. Until I felt them touch my hands. It was over. After all the fear, all the running, all the silence, it was really over. Miller smiled gently and said, "You and your husband raised a good man, Mary. The world needs more people like your son." I looked at Ethan and said, "The world needs more people like all of us, kind, honest, and brave, even when afraid." The next morning, the sun returned clear and bright. The storm was gone and everything smelled fresh and knew. We packed our few things and stood at the edge of the property looking out over the open fields. Ethan turned to Miller and said, "I'll never forget what you did for us." Miller smiled. "You just live your life." "Well, son, that's the best way to thank me." As we drove away down the long dirt road, I looked back one last time at the quiet place that had been our refuge. It had witnessed our fear, our hope, our survival, and now our rebirth. I reached for David's hand and whispered, "We made it." He squeezed my fingers gently and said, "We always do." Ethan leaned forward. Reward from the back seat, his voice soft and steady. "Mom, Dad, can we go home now?" I turned and smiled at him. "Home," I said, "is wherever we're together." The road home looked different than I remembered. The fields were wider, the trees older, and the wind carried a smell that reminded me of every season we had ever lived through the town. Came into view slowly small houses with white fences, children riding their bikes and people waving to one another. It was the same place that had held our happiest memories before everything had gone wrong. Ethan leaned his head against the window and said quietly, "It feels strange coming back after so long." David smiled faintly. "It feels right, though," he said. "You can't run forever. At some point you have to live again." I nodded softly, knowing he was right. When we reached the driveway, I just sat there for a while, staring at the house. The paint had peeled in a few places, the garden was wild and overgrown, but it was still home. That old porch still stood strong, like it had been waiting for us all this time. I whispered to David, "Do you think we can fix it?" He smiled at me and said, "We can fix anything, Mary." The first few days back were quiet. We unpacked, cleaned, and tried to settle into normal life. The neighbors came by one. Some were surprised to see us. Others just hugged us tight without asking a single question. One of them, Mrs. Harper, brought a basket of muffins and said, "Honey, I don't know what happened to you, but I am so glad you're home." Ethan started working again part-time at the hardware store downtown. He said it helped him feel grounded again. I could see the old spark returning in his eyes. Bit by bit, he was learning to laugh again. David spent hours repairing the fence and the porch. He loved that kind of work. It made him feel useful again. But the nights were still hard. Sometimes I would wake up in the dark and listen to the quiet house. My heart would race for no reason, and I would remember the fear, the sound of tires on gravel, the whisper of PR. "Attend, we're dead." I would reach for David's hand beside me and remind myself we were safe now. A few weeks later, we got a letter from Miller. He had been transferred to another city to lead a new branch of the bureau. His letter said, "You were right, Mary. Sometimes courage doesn't look like fighting back. Sometimes it's choosing to forgive." He wrote that the insider named Walter had turned himself in and was now helping investigators expose other hidden crimes. He ended the letter with, "I think maybe your story saved more people than you realize." I sat on the porch after reading that letter. The wind moved softly through the trees, and I thought about forgiveness and how heavy it is to carry hate for too long. When you let it go, it feels like learning to breathe again. Ethan came out and sat beside me. He said, "Mom, I've been thinking I want to study law. I want to help people who go through things like we did, people who don't have anyone to stand for them." I looked at him with tears in my eyes, and Dee said, "You'll be amazing at it because you know what justice really means." Time began to move forward like a river finding its path again. We fixed the garden, planted new flowers, painted the porch white again. The house began to look alive, just like we were learning to live again. One evening, I was sitting outside watching the sunset when David brought 2 cups of tea. He handed me one and sat down beside me. He said, "You know, Mary, there was a time I thought we'd never see this again, this peace, this quiet, this light." I nodded and said, "Maybe that's what makes it so beautiful now. We lost so much, but we learned what truly matters." He smiled and said, "You've always been the brave one." I shook my head and said, "No, we both were. Courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about holding on even when you are." Ethan came out with an old photo album. He sat between us and opened it. The first picture was from years ago, the 3 of us standing on that same porch, sunlight spilling behind us. He smiled and sighed. "We should take a new one. Same spot. Same smiles." So we did. David set up his old camera, the one that still worked. Somehow we stood close together, the wind lifting my hair a little, the evening light soft around us. The click of the camera sounded like a promise. That night I couldn't sleep. I walked outside, the moonlight glowing over the field. I thought about everything we'd survived, about how a single whisper had saved our lives. Pretend we're dead, and how those words had somehow brought us back to life in the end. I looked up at the stars and whispered thank you to the heavens, to the people who helped us, to the love that refused to die inside us. No one heard, but I knew that somewhere the universe listened. From that day forward, I promised myself that I would keep telling our story, not as a tale of fear or betrayal,
of what had happened
but
to
as a
us spread
story of
quietly
survival,
through the town,
of family,
not
and
in
of
a
the
dramatic
strength
way,
that comes
not in
when
gossip,
love
but like a
refuses to
gentle
break. Whisper that carried from one kind soul to another. People began to stop me in the grocery store or at the post office, saying things like, "Mary, I heard a bit about your story. You're stronger than most of us could ever be." I never quite knew what to say to that, because I didn't feel strong, I just felt grateful. One afternoon, the pastor from the local church came by. He said, "Mary, would you mind speaking to our women's group next week about courage and forgiveness? They've been asking to hear your story since you came home." I hesitated. I'd never spoken in front of people before. But then I thought, maybe if I shared what we went through, someone else might find a reason not to give up. So I said yes. The day of the meeting came. I wore a simple blue dress, the same one I'd worn to Ethan's high school graduation. The room was filled with faces, both young and old. I could see curiosity in their eyes, but also kindness. I took a deep breath and began to speak. I told them about the night everything changed, about fear, about loss, and about how love had been the only thing that kept us breathing. I told them how even in the darkest place, there was always a flicker of light if you refused to let go of hope. When I finished, there was silence for a moment. Then one woman stood up and said, "Mary, my daughter hasn't spoken to me in years. Maybe it's time I forgive her." Tears filled my eyes. And I realized that telling our story was more than remembering pain. It was about reminding others that healing is possible. After that day, more people started coming to our house. Some just wanted to talk. Others wanted advice or prayer. The porch became a small place of comfort. People would sit with a cup of tea and tell me about their broken families, their regrets, their fears, and somehow I always found words to help them, even when I didn't know how. David used to watch me and smile. He said, "You found your purpose, Mary." I laughed softly. "Maybe it found me," I said. Ethan came home one evening from his classes holding a letter. He said, "Mom, they accepted me into the university's pre-law program. I start in the fall." I hugged him tight and said, "I knew you could do it, son. I'm proud of you." He smiled and said, "I wouldn't have gotten here without you and Dad." That night we celebrated with a simple dinner, the three of us around the same table where so many tears had once fallen. This time there was laughter and peace. It felt like the universe had given us back everything we thought we'd lost. A few months later, a journalist came to town. She had heard about my talk at the church and wanted to write an article about survival and faith. At first, I didn't want to open old wounds again, but then I thought maybe our story could reach even further, so I agreed. She sat with me for hours, listening quietly as I spoke. I didn't change the truth or hide the pain, but I made sure she understood that our story wasn't about tragedy. It was about love that refused to die. When the article was published, people from other towns started sending letters. Some shared their own stories of betrayal and forgiveness. Others just said, "Thank you for reminding me that I can start over." Every letter felt like a small miracle. One cold evening in December, I was sitting by the fireplace when David came and sat beside me. He held my hand and said, "Do you ever think about that night on the cliff?" I nodded. Sometimes I still wake up hearing the wind and the fear, but then I look at you and Ethan and I remember how far we've come. He smiled. "You know, Mary, sometimes I think that night didn't break us, it rebuilt us." We sat there quietly for a long time, the fire crackling softly and the snow falling outside. I realized how strange life is, how something meant to destroy us had instead become the reason we found new strength. Later that week, the church invited me again. This time, they wanted me to speak to young people about choices and courage. I told them that bravery doesn't always mean fighting. Sometimes it means forgiving. Sometimes it means walking away. Sometimes it means standing still and saying, I will not let fear change who I am. After the talk, a teenage girl came up to me. She said, Miss Mary, my brother hurt our family really bad, but I want to believe he can change. I told her, I don't know what your story will look like, sweetheart. But I know this. You'll never regret choosing kindness, even when it's hard. She smiled through her tears and hugged me tight. When she left, I felt a quiet peace inside. It was then I understood that surviving wasn't the end of our story. Helping others was the beginning of a new one. A few months passed after that winter. The snow melted slowly, and spring began to paint the town with color again. The air smelled like new beginnings, and sunlight warmed the windows of our little house. Life had become gentle again, filled with ordinary moments that once felt impossible. One morning I received a letter with no return address. The paper was folded neatly. Inside was a small note written in careful handwriting. It said, Your story reached me. I thought I was alone, but now I believe I can start again. Thank you. The signature was only an initial, just the letter R. I read it over and over, my eyes wet with quiet tears. Sometimes the smallest words can carry the biggest weight. Ethan was deep into his classes now, studying long hours, but still coming home every weekend to help with chores and talk about everything he was learning. He said, Mom, the law can be complicated, but when I study, I think of what you and Dad went through, and it reminds me why truth matters. I smiled and told him, Son, truth and kindness are the two strongest things in the world. If you live by those, you'll always be proud of yourself. One afternoon, Pastor Green stopped by again. He said, Mary, you're not going to believe this, but a community center in the next county wants you to speak at their spring gathering. They read the article about you and think your story could help families who've lost hope. My first reaction was to say, no, I was just a small town woman. I wasn't someone used to standing in front of crowds. But then David looked at me and said, you were strong enough to live through it. Mary, you're strong enough to tell it. So the following week we drove to the next town. The community center was full by the time we arrived. People from all walks of life, farmers, teachers, mothers, fathers, even teenagers, sat quietly waiting. I stood at the front, my hands trembling just a little, and then I began. I told them how fear can take everything from you if you let it, and how forgiveness can return what fear stole. I told them that sometimes the ones we love hurt us, and sometimes we have to walk through fire before we find light again. I spoke about Ethan, about David, about the night that changed everything, and the morning that gave it all back. When I finished, the room was silent. Then a man in the back stood and said, Ma'am, my son and I haven't spoken in 10 years, but after hearing you, I think I'm going to call him tonight. His voice cracked when he said it, and people began to clap quietly. It wasn't loud applause, just soft, steady claps full of emotion. After the gathering, several people came to talk to me. They shared stories of broken families, of fear, of second chances. I listened to each one and realized something I hadn't before. When you share your pain, it doesn't divide you from others, it connects you to them. That night on the drive home, David said, you changed lives today, Mary. I smiled and said, maybe they changed mine too, because every time I tell our story, I feel a little more free. We reached home late, the moon high and pale above the fields. I stood outside for a moment, breathing in the cool night air. The house glowed softly from the porch light, and I thought about how far we'd come from hiding in fear to standing in the light unafraid. The next morning I got another letter. This one was from Miller I. She said, Mary, I read the article about your talks. I'm proud of you. We never know how strong a person truly is until life tests them, and you proved what faith really looks like. He ended with, tell Ethan to keep studying. The world needs people like him. David read the letter aloud and smiled. Maybe we should frame this one. I laughed softly. Maybe we should frame all of them, every letter, every message, because they remind us that pain can become purpose. The days turned into weeks, and soon our porch was full of life again. Children from the neighborhood would stop by to play in the yard. Neighbors came for tea, and laughter returned to the walls that once echoed with silence. I started writing in a small notebook my thoughts, my memories, everything I'd learned. I didn't know if anyone would ever read it, but it felt good to put it all down. One evening, as the sun set orange over the fields, David brought out 2 rocking chairs we'd found at a yard sale. He set them on the porch and said, "This feels right." We sat there side by side, rocking gently, listening to the crickets and the soft wind. He turned to me and said, "You know, Mary, I think this is what healing looks like. It's not forgetting, it's remembering without pain." I looked at him and said, "Maybe that's what forgiveness really means, remembering with peace." We sat there until the stars came out, and I whispered a small prayer of gratitude for everything, the good and the bad, because both had shaped us into who we had become. The next few weeks passed softly like a quiet song that plays when the world slows down. The garden had begun to bloom again, and every morning the air smelled like fresh rain, and hope I would sit on the porch with my cup of tea and watch the sunlight touch the flowers. I never thought peace could feel this gentle after everything we went through. One morning, as I was sweeping the porch, a car pulled up in front of the house. A woman stepped out, dressed neatly with kind eyes and a notebook in her hand. She introduced herself as Clara, a writer working on a book about real stories of survival and forgiveness. She said, "Mary, I've heard your talks. People still speak about you. I'd love to include your journey if you'll allow it." At first, I hesitated because telling our story always opened up old wounds. But then I thought maybe the more it's told, the lighter it becomes, so I nodded and said, "Come inside." Clara sat at our kitchen table listening as I spoke. I told her everything, the fear, the love, the small miracles that kept us alive. She didn't interrupt, she just listened quietly, and sometimes her eyes glistened when I spoke about Ethan and his strength. When she left, she said, "Mary, your story isn't just about survival. It's about transformation. I think it will help people see that even the deepest pain can bloom into something good." A few days later, Ethan called from the city. He sounded excited. He said, "Mom, you won't believe this. One of my professors read the article about you and invited me to speak to my class about justice and courage." I felt so proud. I said, "Son, remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about being honest." He said, "I know, Mom, you taught me that." Life began to move in a rhythm that felt calm but filled with purpose again. David fixed old furniture for neighbors. I started helping at the local community center, teaching young women how to find their confidence again through simple things like journaling and kindness. It amazed me how sharing kindness could heal pieces of yourself too. One afternoon, I sat with a young woman named Anna. She had tears in her eyes and said, "Miss Mary, my mother hurt me so much, but I still love her. I just don't know how to forgive." I told her forgiveness doesn't mean pretending it didn't hurt. It means deciding you won't let the hurt rule your heart anymore. She smiled weakly and said, "I think I understand now." I hugged her and whispered, "You're stronger than you think, sweetheart." That night I sat by the window looking out at the moonlight. The air was cool and still. I could hear the faint sound of David's breathing from the next room. I thought about everything we had lost and everything we had found again, and I realized something I had never truly seen before. We didn't survive just for ourselves, we survived, so others could believe that they could too. A few weeks later, Clara returned. She had the first printed copy of her book in her hands. The title read, "Still Standing, the Power of Forgiveness." And on the cover was a small picture of a sunrise. She said, "Mary, your chapter is one of my favorites. I wanted you to have this copy first." My hands trembled a little as I held it. The pages smelled like new paper and hope. That evening, I read the chapter aloud to David and Ethan over the phone. The words didn't feel like mine anymore. They felt like everyone's story, like a prayer for anyone who had ever been broken and kept going anyway. Months passed, and the book spread quietly through towns and small libraries. People began writing letters again. Some came far, places I'd never even heard of. One woman wrote, "I was ready to give up, but then I read about you, and now I believe I can forgive my husband." Another wrote, "My daughter and I talked for the first time in 10 years after reading your story." Each letter felt like a small light glowing across the distance. I kept them all in a wooden box beside my bed. Sometimes when the world felt heavy, I'd open it and read one to remind myself why our story mattered. One evening near the end of summer, I sat outside watching fireflies. When David joined me, he looked at the horizon where the sky burned orange and pink. He said, "You ever think about how close we came to losing it all?" I nodded softly and said, "Every day. But then I think about how much we gained too." He smiled and said, "Maybe that's the secret, Mary. When you survive something like that, you stop taking miracles for granted." The sun dipped low, and for a long while we just sat there listening to the crickets and feeling the warmth fade into twilight. I whispered thank you, not to anyone in particular, maybe to life itself for giving us another chance. As the stars began to appear, I knew deep inside that the story wasn't just ours anymore. It belonged to everyone who ever loved deeply, lost painfully, and found their way back to hope again. The morning air felt different that day, like the world itself was holding its breath. I had just finished watering the flowers when the phone rang. It was Clara, her voice bright and full of excitement. She said, "Mary, there is something I need to tell you. The book reached the State Library Association, and they are organizing a conference about resilience. They want you to be the keynote speaker." For a moment, I couldn't say a word. My heart started to beat faster, me speak in front of hundreds of people. I laughed nervously and said, "Clara, I'm no public speaker. I'm just a woman who survived." Clara said softly that exactly why they want you, because your truth is simple and real. When I told David, he smiled that calm smile of his and said, "You always said you wanted to help people. Now the world is asking you to do it." I looked at him feeling both nervous and grateful and said, "What if my voice shakes? What if I forget what to say?" He took my hand and said, "Then speak from your heart, Mary. It never forgets." The days leading up to the conference felt long. I would sit on the porch reading notes and thinking about what to say. But every time I tried to write a speech, the words felt too heavy, too polished, too far from how I really spoke. So one night I threw all the papers away and said out loud, "I'll just tell them the truth." When the day came, I wore a simple gray dress and a small cross necklace that David had given me years ago. The drive to the city was quiet. Ethan came with us, his hand on my shoulder most of the way. When we arrived, the building looked big and bright, people moving everywhere, voices echoing off the high ceiling. They led me to a small room behind the stage. I could hear the sound of the audience settling in laughter, conversations, whispers. Clara came to hug me and said, "They're ready when you are." I took a deep breath, closed my eyes and whispered a little prayer for courage. Then I walked onto the stage. The lights were warm on my face, and for a second everything blurred. The crowd looked endless faces, watching, waiting. I took the microphone, my hands trembling slightly, and said, "Hello, my name is Mary, and I never thought I'd stand in front of so many people in my life." A few soft laughs came from the audience, and I felt my shoulders relax. I began to tell them our story, not as something dramatic or sad, but as something human. I spoke about fear and how it changes people, about love that never gives up, about the night when everything broke and the morning when forgiveness began. I told them how forgiveness isn't weakness but freedom. As I spoke, the room grew quieter until you could almost hear people breathing together. Some cried, some smiled, and others just sat still like they were airing something from their own lives. I ended by saying we all have a choice. When pain comes, we can let it turn our hearts to stone, or we can let it teach us to be gentle. I chose gentle, and it saved me. When I stepped back, the entire room stood up. People clapped softly at first, then louder, but I didn't feel pride. I felt peace. Clara came on stage with tears in her eyes and whispered, "You did it, Mary. You gave them hope." Afterward, many people came to speak with me. A woman in a wheelchair took my hand and said, "I lost everything last year, but you made me believe I can start again." A young man said, "I haven't spoken to my father in 5 years. I'm going to call him tonight." Each word felt like a ripple in a pond, traveling farther than I could see. When we left the hall, the evening sky was golden. The air smelled of rain and flowers. David looked at me and said, "I told you your heart would remember what to say." I smiled and said, "You were right as always." We walked together to the car and I looked back. One last time at the building behind us, I thought of all those faces, all those hearts, and I felt a warmth deep inside that I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't pride, it was purpose. On the drive home, Ethan leaned forward from the back seat and said, "Mom, that was incredible. I think people will remember you for a long time." I turned to him and said, "Son, I don't want them to remember me. I just want them to remember what forgiveness can do." He nodded quietly and said, "They will, Mom, they will." That night when we reached home, I sat on the porch again under the stars. The wind was soft. The world was still. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Thank you again, not just for survival, but for the chance to turn pain into light." David came out and placed a blanket around my shoulders. He said, "You've come full circle, Mary, from fear to peace." I leaned my head against his shoulder and said, "Maybe that's what life is, David, one long circle that always leads us back to love years past like soft footsteps across time RL." Little town changed, faces came and went. New houses rose on quiet streets, but the porch and the old oak tree outside our home remained the same. I grew older. My hair turned silver and my hands became slower, but my heart felt lighter than it ever had before. Ethan graduated with honors. He stood tall in his black gown, smiling wide as he looked for us in the crowd. When they called his name, I felt tears running down my cheeks. David squeezed my hand and whispered, "That's our boy later." Ethan hugged us both and said, "Mom, Dad, we made it." I told him, "No, son, you made it, and we couldn't be prouder." He went on to work with a non-profit helping families who had lost everything after disasters. He would call every week and tell me stories of people finding hope again. And every time I'd listen with a full heart, knowing our story had become part of something bigger. David still fixed things for the neighbors, though slower than before. He said, "It keeps my hands busy and my soul calm. Sometimes in the evenings we sit outside in those same rocking chairs watching the sunset while I read letters from people who had written over the years, letters from strangers who had somehow found strength in our story. I kept them all in a wooden box that now overflowed with kindness." One afternoon, Clara came by again. She had grown older too, but her smile hadn't changed. She said, "Mary, I wanted to tell you something. The book you were part of has now been added to the National Library Archive so that future generations can read about real courage." I felt my eyes fill with tears and said, "Clara, I never imagined my name would sit in a library." She smiled. "You didn't just tell a story, Mary. You gave people a map to find their way back from the dark. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window watching the stars the same way I had done all those years ago when fear had ruled my life, but now there was no fear left, only gratitude. I whispered into the quiet, "Thank you for giving us another chance, for letting love be strong. Rather than hate, for teaching us that forgiveness is freedom." A few years later, David's health began to fade. He grew weaker each season, but his spirit stayed gentle. He would hold my hand and say, "Don't you worry, Mary, I'm not afraid. We've had a good life together." One night he fell asleep beside me, holding my hand, and didn't wake up. The house felt too quiet after that, but somehow it didn't feel empty. I could still feel him in every corner, in every ray of morning light. Ethan came home and stayed for a long time. He fixed the porch, repainted the walls, and said, "Mom, this house is a piece of our history. We can't let it fade." I smiled and said, "You're right. It's not just wood and paint. It's where love learned how to survive." The years moved softly after that. I began writing again in my old notebook, not for the world, but for myself. And for Ethan, I wanted him to remember not the pain, but the beauty that came after it. I wrote about David's laughter, the kindness of strangers, the sound of the wind on Nig. We thought we wouldn't make it, and the miracle of waking up to another sunrise. One evening, Ethan brought his own little boy to visit a sweet child with bright eyes and a smile like his father's. He ran around the yard laughing while Ethan said, "Mom, I told him all about Grandpa and about you, about how you taught us that courage is quiet and forgiveness is power." I smiled and felt my heart fill with warmth beyond words. Later, when the stars came out, we sat on the porch together, 3 generations under the same sky. The little one leaned against me and asked, "Grandma, are you happy?" I looked at him and said, "I am very happy, sweetheart, because we made it through everything and we still have love." As the night grew deeper and the air turned cool, I closed my eyes listening to the sound of crickets and distant laughter. Somewhere in that quiet, I felt David's presence, gentle and steady like a soft breeze. I whispered, "I kept my promise, love. We lived, we forgave, we kept the light burning, the wind moved." Ed through the trees, and I knew he heard me. Time went on, and though seasons changed, the porch light never went out. Ethan kept it glowing every night, just like his father used to. People in town still stopped by to visit or drop off letters, or just to sit for a while in the peace of that porch. They said it felt different there, lighter somehow, as if the walls remembered what forgiveness sounded like. And maybe they did, because long after I was gone, people still told our story not as a tragedy, but as proof that even in the darkest night, the heart can find its way back to love, that pain can be a teacher, that kindness can heal what fear breaks, and that forgiveness doesn't erase what happened, it simply sets you free. Our story became more than survival. It became a quiet hymn carried on the wind, whispered from one heart to another, a reminder that no matter what happens, no matter how deep the hurt, love always finds its way home. And somewhere under the same wide American sky where the stars ever forget to shine, the porch light still glows in the night, gentle and steady for anyone who has ever been lost, reminding them that healing is real and hope never dies. The end.